Hello, everybody, and a warm welcome to this event for the Lockdown LitFest, where my guest today was born on the Isle of Wight, where his father was prison governor at Camp Hill Prison. He's the author of several novels. He also writes short stories and novellas. He's published one book of non-fiction on the American novelist Armistead Maupin, and also writes book reviews for the Daily Telegraph. His first two novels, Ease and the Aerodynamics of Pork, were published on the same day in 1986. His book of short stories, Dangerous Pleasures, contains his first published short story, Borneo, which was shortlisted for the Whitbread Short Story Award, and Wig, which was produced on stage as a touring live literature performance. Since then, he's written in total about 20 works and has been called by Richard Canning one of the great unsung British novelists. It's my great honour and privilege and pleasure to introduce to the Lockdown LitFest stage Mr. Patrick Gale. How are you, Patrick?
I'm very well, Paul. Lovely to see you.
It's lovely to see you too. Tell us where in the world you are. Where are we speaking to you from?
I am sitting in the Richard and Judy shed, which is my idyllic little oak-lined study in my garden at Land's End. So I'm at the very tip of Cornwall.
You've mentioned the Richard and Judy shed. Why is it the Richard and Judy shed?
Oh, because bless them, they picked one of my novels, Notes from an Exhibition, for their book club before they went online, when they were still on telly, and it was a huge deal. And it really changed my life. So I not only managed to build this lovely office, having never had an office before, but I also commissioned a Baroque cello for myself. So I had the Richard and Judy cello as well as the Richard and Judy shed.
Nice to get the coverage. And you play, I understand.
I do. I'm very keen.
Your first book, let's come to what I would like to do, Patrick, is to give our audience an idea of the scope and breadth and the tidal flows of your career as a writer. As I mentioned in the introduction, I think if my counting is right, you've published around 20 works, including novels, short stories, novellas, and not really a biography of Armistead Maupin, but we'll come to that as the transcript really of conversations, the relationship with him. But your first novel, The Aerodynamics of Pork, published on the same day in 1985 or 6, depending on which source of reference you use. How on earth did that happen?
Oh, only because Penguin didn't want me. I'd sold both books to a publisher which, before publication, was taken over. This was in the days of the great sort of publishing takeovers. They were taken over by Penguin. Penguin didn't want me in the long term. So they published a hardback of one book and a paperback of the other on the same day, which was incredibly good news for me because it meant that these books got far more coverage than slim first and second novels deserve.
It's a hell of a launch. And there was something rather subversive about Aerodynamics of Pork, I seem to remember, with regarding the Betty Trask Prize. Was that conscious?
Yes, but back in those days, the Betty Trask Prize was purely for romance fiction. And so I conceived this first novel, The Aerodynamics, as an alternative romance entry. I didn't think for one moment it would get a look in at the Betty Trask, but it was a nice exercise. And I think for your first novel, you often need some kind of carrot to keep you going.
Yes, I mean, the Betty Trask, so people know, was for romantic fiction. You rather subverted it by focusing on alternative romances as they were then. Every love affair had a gay or a lesbian or was somehow twisted, and the narrative alternated between chapters. It was just absolutely fantastically conceived. In fact, that brings me to this. So you were aboard at the Pilgrim School, where you were chorister. You went to Winchester College, and then read English at Oxford Literature, but then did a series of odd jobs to support your writing. So I'm guessing that at some stage there was a trigger point, a hinge point in your career when you thought, oh, actually, my name is Patrick Gale, and I am going to be a writer for all my life.
Well, funnily enough, no. I was desperate to be an actor. I spent most of my career at Oxford acting. One term, I think I actually did 2 plays in one term. It's amazing I got any essays written at all. And although I'd always loved writing, and I'd written plays and short stories and whatnot in my teens, I was completely overwhelmed by the brilliance of the authors we were studying when I was a student. And the last thing I imagined was becoming a novelist. No, I was trying to become an actor. And I got one of my first paying jobs in London was working as a singing waiter in Covent Garden in a terrible restaurant, now closed down. because I was trying to get my equity card. In those days, you had to have an equity card to go to auditions. And I wrote the first novel, The Aerodynamics, while I was working as a waiter, really just to keep myself awake, because this restaurant's gimmick was that it was open all night long. So my shifts would be 12 hours from 6 in the evening to 6 in the morning. And nobody was coming in until the strip clubs closed in Soho. And then we do a frantic breakfast service for all the strippers, which was great fun. Got very good tips. So I wrote the book just to keep myself awake. And it was only, I think, when I'd written my second book, which was equally lightweight and short, that I finally got lunch with an agent. And I only got lunch with that agent because his then assistant was a friend of mine from Oxford, who she was also trying to become an actor. And she slipped a copy of The Aerodynamics of Pork onto his going home pile one weekend, very kindly. And he says to this day, he only picked it up because it had such a silly title. He was curious. And he is still my agent, bless him. So yeah,
Oh, fantastic.
that relationship lasted.
Yeah, that relationship lasted. That sounds like a good one. For some reason, I seem to have the picture of the restaurant. I don't know which one it is in my head, but was it rather flamboyant with a lot of floral displays and sort of swagging outside the front?
No, it was very maroon and rather dull. It was on Longacre, next door to where Stanford's, the wonderful bookshop, the travel bookshop used to be.
Used to be, but no longer is. They've just moved around the corner. So having decided that, well, having realized that you could write and that you were going to, in fact, let's come back. Where did the will to write come from? As I said, you were born on the Isle of Wight. Your father was a prison governor. Was it a bookish family? Were your parents?
I was incredibly lucky. It was a very bookish family. There were not just walls of books in virtually every room, but mountains of library books. This was the great age of the lending library, and both my parents would come back every week with baskets of books they brought back. And so I got the habit very young. And I think, like a lot of novelists, my impulse to write is really inseparable from my impulse to read. I think it just completes the circle for me. And when I'm writing, I'm thinking all the time of reading, and I am my own first reader, I suppose.
So are you
due to analyze it too much?
Well, so many novelists I've spoken to sort of have this theory that they write the books that they'd like to read, but nobody else has bothered to write them, so they have to write them themselves. Do you fall into that
totally. And I think most of us have that nightmare when we're writing, that we'll wake up one morning and somebody else will have written the very book we are currently writing. You do see that happen occasionally. There'll be a sudden flurry of books about Henry James or whatever. Yes, so now I vaccinate against that by talking a lot while I'm writing about what I'm writing, in the hope that it'll put other writers off that subject.
That's worked so far, I trust.
So far, touch wood, yeah.
Can we talk about your authorial voice, Patrick? Because it strikes me, you have a number of different styles which sort of all converge, and you do this sort of poignant sweetness, a lot of fantastically innovative and inventive comedy, but you seem to write about relationships by and large, both subverting them and also portraying them. It's sort of a very English style that you have about middle class and upper class relationships, about class divides, stuff like that, but also about the love across divides. Has that been a strategy, or have I just got it wrong?
No, it's not been a strategy. It's I suppose I've calmed down. I've actively tried to calm my writing down since I started. Like a lot of writers who are very young when they start, I began by showing off a lot. And I've since learned that the most effective voice for me is quite a calm one. And I try to make my writing as near as possible to my own conversational voice, because I don't want people to notice the writing. I want them to pass through that and get lost in the story and take the story almost as an alternative reality. And they won't do that if they keep stubbing their toe on little jewels of metaphor or whatever. So when I'm rewriting, a lot of that process is to do with calming the prose right down, taking out anything I think is particularly clever or wonderful, and making it not flat exactly, but translucent. I suppose that's what I aspire to. And when I think about it, the writers I admire, a lot of them write in a similarly discreet voice, I suppose.
Who are you influenced by? Who do you admire?
There are so many. I'm a big admirer of several Irish writers. I love Colm Tóibín. In the States, I love Anne Patchett and Anne Tyler, who are both very, very calm writers. I loved Carol Shields. I do read a lot of women writers, but I'm quite omnivore as well. And I think one of the joys of becoming established as a novelist, especially if you're quite busy on social media, as I am, is that you are sent books all the time. So I realized the other day it's a rare treat when I go into a bookshop under my own steam and actually buy a book that I want. An awful lot of my reading is accidental. It's books that have come to me through the post, which have caught my eye.
It is indeed a pleasure. I mean, there are a lot of people that have names that have been associated with you in lots of reviews that I've read about you. Everybody from Iris Murdoch, Evelyn Waugh, Ian Forster, and Beryl Bainbridge. Do you see these as people? Do you align yourself with writers such as this?
I'd be honoured to be aligned with them. I mean, Iris Murdoch and Ian Forster are both very strong influences on me.
Right.
Dame Iris, especially when I was starting out, because I began writing my novels when I had not long discovered her, and I devoured her books back to back. So that had a very strong influence. Not always a good influence, I have to say. Though the abiding influence she has left with me, I think, is my approach to love in my stories. I'm a great admirer, and I enjoy the way love can be so overwhelming and so destructive within a plot. It's incredibly useful. And I also ape her total withholding of judgment when it comes to love. She treats love almost as a force of nature. It's something that can't be argued with and just has to be dealt with, and which is often as destructive as it is transformative. And Ian Forster, I think, has been a big influence in that his greatest novels are highly educative. That sounds very dry, but they're stories about people who are drawn out in the kind of Latin route of education. They're drawn out of their initial concept of who they are, and they become someone different. I have this ideal that not only will my stories portray those kind of life changes, but they might just occasionally change the life of the reader as well, or change the opinions of the reader.
The transformative power of fiction. You mentioned that, I have to pick up on it, that Iris Murdoch is not always a good influence. What do you mean by that?
Well, her books are not entirely realistic. They are often extremely artificial in their plotting. She in her turn was very influenced by Plato, and that shows in her dialogue. She often has pages and pages and pages of quite discursive philosophical dialogue, in which people don't talk the way real people talk at all. And my early books are like that. They are quite arch in the way some Iris Murdoch novels are arch. But that said, I'm not dissing her at all. If I could write a novel as great as The Black Prince or The Sea, I would be a very happy man.
Wouldn't we all? One of the things I want to talk to you about is about how you engage with the characters you write, how they come to you, how you handle them, what your relationship with them is, and how that changes. Because for all that I'm trying to use this as a showcase for you to show what a brilliant storyteller you are, it is the characters that you create that live on in the memory, for me at least, as one of your readers, so long afterwards. How do characters form in your mind?
That's a very good question. I think one of the big lessons I've learned is not to fret about plot, but to focus on character.
Right.
Because I think the most engaging and lifelike plots, if you're not assuming you're not writing a thriller or whodunit, the most engaging and lifelike plots seem to arise almost organically from the characters you've assembled and the way those characters interact. So my early kind of note-taking stage on any novel is about building character and interrogating those characters to work out how they tick, what makes them tick. I've often said that I am a frustrated psychotherapist. That's certainly the career choice I'd have made, I think, back in my 20s, had novel writing and acting not taken off. Because I'm endlessly fascinated by why we make the repeated mistakes we make, why we fall in love with the people we fall in love with, but also why children grow up a certain way, and the damage we do in the name of love. I suppose that sums it up, really. So a lot of my novels have plots which allow me to explore childhoods. I'm fascinated by childhoods, and I love setting the childhood of a character alongside their adulthood. So my most recent novel, Take Nothing With You, does that right from the start. It swings between Eustace, the hero, in his 50s to when he's a little boy still finding his way in the world. Because I think I love the idea that we all of us, in a way, carry around our childhood selves, complete with all their resentments and loves and hopes and fantasies. And in a way, your maturity is defined by the extent to which you have dealt with that childhood self. And it fascinates me occasionally you'll meet somebody in their 60s who is still a spoiled little girl or a spoiled little boy. They haven't dealt with some resentment from way back then. And you long to take them on one side and say, listen, just tell me about it. I'll put you in the book, but it'll be fine and you'll feel much better afterwards.
I like that you said psychotherapist would have been a career choice in your 20s, and that your will to have been an actor in your late teens, which is all about character. So you saying that when you are writing, you are in part inhabiting the character. How does that relationship work?
It's very like the relationship you hear actors have with the character they're playing. I have to know the character intimately from the shoes up. And often, actually, when I'm rewriting a novel, I'll realize that I now know who the character is, and I didn't when I began the novel. So a lot of the changes I make in a second draft will be smoothing out who that character is. And recently I've done several projects where, and I'm working on one at the moment, where I write about a real life person. So I'm working on the novel at the moment about the great Cornish poet Charles Causley and his mother, Laura, who was a laundress. And I have the bare bones of their lives. I know the facts, but they were both extremely discreet people about their emotional lives. So what I'm having to do in a way is a piece of detective work, a bit like being a biographer. I'm having to pick through the ashes of their lives to find the jewels. But I'm also inevitably having to make stuff up that will help me make sense of what they did and the choices they made.
Do you have to like the character, or does it change the writing if you like the character, or is it more interesting to write about characters you don't actually like?
I think you have to be interested, deeply interested in them. If you were bored by them, it would be fatal. And I have occasionally started on a character and realized they didn't engage me, and so they were never going to engage the reader, and they've just been dropped. I'm going through a very interesting process with Causley, because Causley is a bit of a national treasure, at least down here in Cornwall. And you never hear a bad word said about him. And yet, the deeper I've dug into his character and his poems and his private diaries, the more prickly and ambiguous he's becoming to me. And that, of course, is interesting me all the more. So I'm taking the risk of showing him as a not terribly nice person, at least at first. But I hope I'm also showing enough of what made him tick to make people bear with him and maybe fall in love with him all the same. I think it's weakness and fallibility in a character that wins the reader over, not heroism. So
yes,
you have to take that risk of showing the faults and hope the reader will have enough sympathy or enough patience to bear with you.
We like to see the frailties and overcoming the difficulties to come to a triumph.
Absolutely.
You know, it's part of the human engagement. You famously injected Barbara Hepworth into a story in the past. How do you handle writing about somebody who is, or injecting into a novel someone who is, of course, a name that resonates with everybody?
That's very hard. It's a big risk, and I haven't done it very often. I mean, but Barbara Hepworth, I felt I had to include it because it was a novel about a totally fictitious but very brilliant female artist working in West Cornwall. And I knew the risk was that people reading the novel would think, oh, well, this is based on Barbara Hepworth, because there are so few famous women artists of that era. So I partly felt I must put Barbara into the book to show that the main character isn't her. But then when I allowed her to become a character, she was so fascinating and a bit of a monster and demanded more and more space in the book. She then ended up playing a rather useful role as a sort of dark mentor for the heroine. And what's quite funny is when I then had to bite the bullet and when the book came out and I had to give readings from it in Cornwall, I realised there would be people, and there always were people in the audience who had known Dame Barbara. And I would dread the Q&A at the end, and a hand would go up, and there'd always be somebody who would say, I knew Dame Barbara. And I'd always think, God, here it comes. And every single time they said, and actually, you were far too kind to her.
Oh,
So
really?
she wasn't, apparently she was a bit more of a monster than I portrayed. But I was very worried about her. And interestingly, there's a film project based on that novel. And I had been fantasizing that Julie Waters is now the perfect age to play a very funny version of Dame Barbara Hepworth in the book. But sadly, but for very good reasons, the character of Dame Barbara does not appear in the film version. She was cut from the script. So,
what a terrible shame. Julie Waters.
I'll just have to write something just about Dame Barbara so that Julie Waters could be persuaded to play her.
While we're talking about known names, you published in 1999 a fantastic book called Armistead Maupin. I think it was actually the title. Can you tell us how that came about and what the idea was?
Yes, it was part of a little series brought out by a small but tasteful publisher, in which they paired LGBTIQ writers with LGBTIQ subjects who had always fascinated them. So they came to me knowing I was a friend of Armistead's, and said, well, would I be interested? And I said, of course I would, if Armistead would. But when I contacted Armistead about it, I did reassure him and say, look, you're still alive, unlike Bessie Smith and some of the other writers in the series, figures in the series. So I will promise to cut out anything you tell me indiscreetly that you don't want to appear in print. And it was a very interesting process. It was lovely for me. It was a chance to go and stay with him and spend a few days just gassing and recording all these wonderfully indiscreet conversations. And the book became, obviously, it's his life story, but told in a slightly quirky way. I tell it thematically. So there's a section about fatherhood, a section about motherhood, and so on. But it was also inevitably a sort of thumbnail sketch of our own friendship and the things we have in common. And he claims, I think, that it helped him to unblock things he hadn't thought about in his life for a long time. And he, of course, has gone on to write a really very charming memoir, certainly about his early life. And I like to think that the process of me interviewing him at such great length for my little book helped him get on with that.
We were talking about childhoods and the children that we spring from, that we turn into adults from. As I understand, there's a certain amount of myth that's accreted around this book. I'd love to find out whether it's true or not, that you were both actually working on novels at the time, and this series of conversations that led to the Armistead Maupin book actually triggered a renewed vigor for both the novels you were working on. Is that true?
It's certainly true for me. I think a little like when I've taught writing courses, that there is something about talking at length to a writer you admire and forcing them to analyze their writing process and their imaginative process that makes you reassess your own, and that can be immensely helpful. So the book I think I've got this right. The book I wrote almost immediately after was Rough Music, which was a breakthrough novel for me. It was very much the first book of mine to be sold in Sainsbury's. That kind of breakthrough. And funnily enough, I also effectively proposed to my husband while staying at Armistead's house in San Francisco while researching that book. So it freed up something else in my life as well. That's why I moved in with Aidan on the farm not long after getting back to England.
Let's talk about the farm and the place that you write from. You are such a supporter of Cornwall. You moved there, if memory serves, in the mid-late 80s. What took you there? What has it given you?
It was the late 90s, actually. I moved down there. I moved to Cornwall in the mid 80s, and I moved down to Cornwall largely by accident and for love, because the chap I was then involved with was an architect who had a big commission to restore an amazing Jacobean manor house and estate in North Cornwall, and the two of us came down here looking for somewhere to rent. And I then realised I could never afford to buy in London on my income, but I could just about afford what was then a time. It seemed a huge mortgage. It was actually a very small mortgage on a cottage in a place called Camelford on the edge of Bodmin Moor. So I spent nearly 10 years, I suppose, living in North Cornwall. And then when I met Aidan and was lucky enough to be able to move down here to the far west, I realised that what I had thought was Cornwall was only really kind of entry-level Cornwall. Proper Cornwall is West Penwyd for me. So once you cross the second major bit of water, travelling across the county, you get to the sort of deep, dark West Cornwall, which is very special indeed. And it's funny, when I first moved down here, Cornwall felt hugely isolated because the internet didn't exist. There was very little in the way of shopping, so it was very easy to live down here very cheaply and quietly. That, of course, has changed. We now have a dual carriageway that comes all the way to Penzance, and we have the internet. And I suspect the visitor numbers in Cornwall have gone through the roof. It's a place now whose population doubles pretty much every summer and autumn. But it feeds my work, and psychologically I do love that sense of removal. It works for me. I think writers, most of us, have some trick for making us feel that we're on the outside looking in. I certainly have always needed that. A sense that I'm not really participating, I'm just watching.
For those that don't write, can you explain why that's important, Patrick? Why it is important to be on the outside as the observer?
I think to sharpen your sense of analysis and focus. I'm always very wary of writing about myself directly. And in many of my books, I'll notice quite early on there's a weak link, and that weak link is often the character who is most like me. And that's always the bit of the book where I have to work the hardest to treat the character who's like me as just another character, and to be able to walk around them and criticize them and get some distance on them. But I think that distance is important generally in fiction. You need to be able to be quite cool, passionately engaged, but cool at the same time, a bit like a slightly drunk surgeon. So you need to be able to be rigorous. And I think often when I read a novel that doesn't quite work, it's because the writer has lost that sense of rigor or detachment. And they become too engaged, and that's often when the book becomes overtly political in an unhelpful way or dogmatic.
That's nicely put. The question I want to ask is a ticklish one, and it would be ticklish for me to ask it of anybody, least of all you, a writer I greatly admire. I mean, you've been shortlisted for the Costa Book Award for Best Novel. You've won the Booksellers Association Independent Booksellers Book Prize, British Book Awards, British and Julie Best Read of the Year 2008, the Impact Doubly Literary Award, and the Whitbread Short Story Award. But you published 20 works. Let me put this simply, and forgive me if this is injurious to our friendship. I don't understand why you haven't won more awards, why you're not world famous, why people aren't singing your praises from the hilltop.
But you're very kind, and it's very flattering. I mean, I've always been phlegmatic about prizes. They are crucial to the publishing industry. Every publisher loves a prize, even if it's just a long listing or a short listing, because it helps to promote a book in a hugely competitive market. But ultimately, for me, the prize, the real prize, is being published and having affectionate and even passionate readers. So I've been the judge of the Costa Prize, which was incredibly useful. I think every writer should go through that process of being a judge, because it makes you realize just how accidental the whole process is, and how very personal and subjective the choices can be. And it is a lottery. Your book, if you're lucky, lands on the desk of the right judge, but most often it will land on the desk of the wrong judge, and it happens. So I regard prizes as being a bit like premium bonds. You've got to buy some, otherwise you'll never win. But you've got to put your book out there. But it doesn't do to lie awake at night thinking about what you would spend if you won them, or writing your acceptance speech for the booker that you might possibly be shortlisted for. I mean, the nearest I've come to anything like that was actually with screenwriting, when the BBC show I wrote, Man in an Orange Shirt, won an international Emmy. And that was extraordinary and something I was up there making an acceptance speech, making a very bad one, has to be said, after weeks of practicing for it. But again, that made me realize how arbitrary it is, and it hasn't changed my life. I mean, I thought on the night, oh, now I've won an Emmy, I will get endless commissions to write lots of wonderful scripts. It doesn't happen. You know, it raises your price a bit. It means my script agent can ask for a bit more when I'm involved in a project. But it's best to keep your feet on the ground, I think.
Can we talk a little bit about adaptation? Because, as you said, one of the things that supports book sales is winning a prize. If the author wins a prize, if the book wins a prize. Another method, of course, is if a story you've written, if a book you've had published is optioned for adaptation for either small or large screen. Where are you with adaptations? Have you been approached? Have you?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And it was quite funny when Man in an Orange Shirt, which wasn't an adaptation, came out. A lot of people thought I'd sprung new formed from an egg as a screenwriter, but in fact I've been writing scripts for about 15 years before that, because novels of mine had been optioned by independent producers with not a great deal of money, and so they had hired me to write the script. So I'd learnt to write scripts on the job. So I adapted Kansas in August twice. I developed little bits of Baby for a BBC show, which didn't happen. It's a very interesting and rather addictive process. I've recently been working on adapting my novel, A Place Called Winter, for television. I was adamant it should be television because it needs to be quite long. If you boiled it down to 90 minutes, it would do too much damage to the story. But I've also been working on adapting a masterpiece by Edith Wharton, The Age of Innocence. And that process of taking a beloved book to pieces and rebuilding it for another form is completely fascinating. And it teaches you a great deal about the mechanisms of storytelling and the necessary brutalities of storytelling on screen, where you have to sacrifice some of your darlings in order to keep the viewer watching.
That's very nicely put. The last book you had published was Take Nothing With You, which you mentioned earlier on, which is really a fantastic analysis of childhood and how we develop out of it with luck. It was published a year or so ago. I know that you're working on a new book now, which we'll talk about in a second, but would you explain what Take Nothing With You was about and perhaps treat us to a reading?
Of course. It's in a way, yes, it's a novel about childhood, and it's a novel about music, because the young hero in the book has his life changed forever by learning the cello. But it's at heart, it's a novel about resilience. So it swings between this character, Eustace, who we first meet in his mid to late 50s, discovering that he has cancer and realizing that he's fallen in love for the second or third time in his life. And it then swings between him in hospital being treated for thyroid cancer and his very strange, rather sad boyhood in Weston-super-Mare, which is where he lives with his deeply unhappy parents in the old people's home they run, and where his life is changed forever by learning the cello. But the bit I'll read is from the very first section of the book, where he's in his 50s and realizing this is about how he falls in love.
Thank you, Patrick.
Nothing about his meeting of Theo was promising. Theo was 20 years younger. He was in the army and he was pretty. Pretty would normally have put Eustace off. He tended to be drawn to men with rough edges, evidence of wear and tear, a bit of heft, or receding or departed hair. He had always found prettiness poignant, doomed as it was to pass, and outright beauty utterly daunting. His possibly unfair assumption was that beauty went with a need for reassurance, whereas imperfect men would be grateful for the attention and accordingly generous. However, the desert camouflage and boots, the occasional sweat patch or glimpse of an enormous and unambiguous gun about his person seemed to balance out Theo's puppyish looks, as did his fearless persistence. You forget there are two of us making choices here, Theo texted, when Eustace had felt obliged to post a suggestion that he would usually have gone for grizzled sergeant major over smooth-skinned captain. But our names are impossible together. We sound like cat breeders. I was nicknamed Stash at school, Eustace admitted. I think I can cope with Eustace. Theo spent several days after that pretending he wasn't really a roughy-tufty soldier at all, but the company's cook, whose pride and joy was his cake decorating and pastry making. He sent photographs of a succession of birthday cakes for the officers and men, each camper than the last, each bravely greeted by Eustace with another compliment. Finally, he confessed that the pictures had been random finds off Google to test and alarm. He was actually a fairly senior officer doing something clandestine. There was sand, though, and date palms, and once a glimpse of spectacular ruins that looked like but couldn't have been Palmyra. He also admitted he had landed his job because of his 2 degrees in Arabic. At this point, they stepped away from the app and onto Skype, because Eustace pretended not to believe him about the Arabic. Goaded to prove it, Theo chatted away in a surprisingly deep voice, while shaving topless and driving Eustace wild by refusing to speak a word of English, before grinning, reaching out to the shelf above his sink with a soapy finger, and hanging up. It was a short step to texting one another images or bulletins from their wildly contrasting days. Eustace introduced Theo to his whippet, Joyce, to his cello, to Kensington Gardens, and to the assembling ladies of the orchestra's cello section, in exchange for meeting a tank full of sweaty squaddies, a scorpion, and a full moon reflected in an oasis. Then Theo happened to Skype while Eustace was having supper, and amused went to fetch his own tray of food and can of Coke, and so they slipped into the comforting habit of weekly supper dates. They made a point not only of regularly eating together, but downloading the same books to read, or, when army broadband permitted, watching the same television programmes simultaneously. Eustace on the sofa with Joyce, Theo sprawled on his bunk. The move from text to video allowed Eustace to latch onto and collect the little imperfections which only made Theo the more endearing. The small chip off one of his incisors, the way his thick eyebrows didn't quite match, a slight tendency to stutter when he was excited, as though his thoughts outran his tongue. And the intimacy of their conversations threw up intriguing parallels between them, less than perfect childhoods, an unfashionable tendency towards monogamy, a belief that dogs were sent to teach us how to love.
Beautifully read, Patrick. Thank you so much.
All that boyhood acting training finally gets to use.
It all goes into the mix. Nothing ever goes to waste, does it? You mentioned cello in that piece on a number of occasions. You mentioned also that you have the Richard and Judy cello. Do you play?
I do. I play a lot. I'm the secretary of the Penzance Orchestral Society, which is one of the country's oldest, longest established cello orchestras, amateur orchestras. And I do quite a lot of chamber music as well. And I'm very lucky that Penzance has such a thriving music scene, so that there's never any lack of things I can get involved in that way. And I do find playing the cello, it feeds into my writing. It's one of those activities where I'm concentrating so hard on the necessary physicality of playing the cello, playing in tune, of working with the other players, that I briefly forget entirely about the book I'm working on. And that's actually quite useful and quite handy.
Sounds marvellous. These are tough times for orchestras in lockdown. How are yours surviving?
It's incredibly hard. I've had to persuade our members to suspend our autumn. We suspended our spring concert. We cancelled that, and but that was just before lockdown, and we've now cancelled all our autumn season. That's very sad. So all we can do is work in small groups. I yesterday had a lovely afternoon because 7 string players and I have got together and we're learning a very little known Bruch octet for strings, and we could play in a church in Penzance, sitting miles apart from each other and all wearing masks at the same time, which is actually incredibly hard because I found my mask was making my glasses steam up at crucial moments. But it's a learning curve. But it made me realize, and we all said this, how desperately we were missing music making. It's such a pleasure to, I don't know, commune with other players through a piece of music.
One of the greatest sadnesses of this lockdown, of course, that we're missing so much live performance, both in terms of literary festivals and music and so much more, not least the theatre. You are a director of the North Cornish Book Festival, North Cornwall Book Festival. Tell us about the North Cornwall Book Festival and your role in it. How are they doing? How are they coping this year?
Oh, well, this year we have had to suspend the festival. It was set to happen, as it always does, at the beginning of October. And although all the writers, I think, were happy to come, we realised that we'd have to impose social distancing, which would simply have made it a nightmare. Financially, we wouldn't have made enough money to break even, but I think it would have ruined the atmosphere. It's a very intimate festival. But half the appeal of it in this beautiful place at St. Endelion is that the readers who come along have a very good chance of meeting the writers in the queue for coffee or whatever. You really feel you've got to know them. So what I've made us do instead is we've made a series of small films, about 25 short films about each of the writers who were going to come down. And I've taken a huge risk, which was allowing the writers to film their own footage using their mobile phones, which our brilliant editors are splicing together with the Zoom interviews around which the films are based, so that we get these very personal glimpses of things you would never normally see at the book festival. So you get to see the writers' lockdown hair, but you also get to see their garden, their dog, whatever. They're very, very charming. I'm really chuffed with how they're going, and we'll be releasing them at tea time every Friday until further notice, to give people a little lift at the start of their weekend.
And how can people watching this find them? Where are they?
If you go to Vimeo or YouTube, or indeed the Book Festival's own website, which is ncornbookfest.org, you'll find them there. I'm putting them up one at a time. At the moment, the only one that's out there is about me, but we've got ones coming up shortly on Petroc Trelawney of the BBC, who not many people know is also writing, and a fantastic novelist, Amanda Craig, who's had a great breakthrough in the last few weeks with her latest novel, The Golden Rule, which is a wonderful celebration and mischievous thriller about the split between town and gown in Cornwall. So the second homeowners versus the locals.
How very funny you should mention her. She's a guest on this very show.
I'm glad to hear it.
And I have to say, I've got her novel, The Golden Rule, is one of my top 5 best reads so far this year. It's an extraordinary piece of work.
It's very clever, and I love the mischievous way she borrows from Strangers on a Train for at least the starting point of her plot.
Patricia Highsmith, Strangers on a Train, and Beauty of the Beast. What not to love about that?
Totally.
You mentioned the Charles Causley Trust earlier on, and forgive me, but I'm not familiar with the name Charles Causley. Can you tell us who he is and what your role is in the trust?
Yes. Charles Causley was a primary school teacher for most of his life in Launceston, which is the town in North Cornwall where he grew up. So on the face of it, he was a man who led a very quiet life indeed. He also, to make it even quieter, he lived with his mother until her death. But he was a brilliant poet, and he became a poet in the course of the Second World War. He was working in the Navy as a coder, and coders had the most extraordinary time because they had to put messages at high speed in and out of these top secret codes, and often deliver very depressing or shocking news to the captain of the ship without revealing to any of their shipmates what they knew as a result of their work. And do all this, in Causley's case, while being appallingly seasick. Poor man. I think he was completely terrified at sea. He was not a born Cornishman in that way. And what I'm doing is writing about him and his mother and the process by which he became a poet. So in the course of the book, you get little hints of the poet to come. And he wrote several amazing poems about his boyhood, but he also wrote some really startlingly, brutally frank ones, emotional ones, to do with his emotional life, which he kept very hidden. But there is one poem which was the starting point for me for wanting to write the book, called Angel Hill, in which he describes a man being visited unexpectedly by a former shipmate, one assumes after the war. And the shipmate, it's in a ballad form, which was a form Causley loved, a very, very traditional, very repetitive refrain. And repeatedly in this poem, the visiting shipmate tries to get this man to admit how close they were, the things they shared, that they shared a pillow, that they bound each other's wounds, and repeatedly the narrator of the poem denies him, rather like St. Peter denying Christ. And when Causley said repeatedly to people, "Oh, I'll never write my memoir because it's all in the poems," I think that poem, Angel Hill, is the starting point. And so when I was invited by the Charles Causley Trust to get involved and become their patron, I was very honoured, because I'm very much not a poet, but I'm a lifelong reader of poems, and I'm passionate about Causley's work, and I really want to make it better known. So I hope my novel will make people intrigued and send them back to the books. A lot of people only know Causley when they're children. They unwittingly learn his poems at school, because as a primary school teacher, he knew the value of poetry for children and wrote marvelous poems that work equally well for children or adults. The most famous one is probably Timothy Winter's, about an abused child, desperately neglected, poverty-struck child, who is somehow falling through the cracks. And that's clearly based on his experiences as a teacher, and a man who grew up in great poverty. And at the moment, the Causley, I should mention, the Causley Festival, the Charles Causley Festival, which is a general literature festival. It carries his name, but it's not just a festival of poetry. That, like the North Cornwall Festival, is having to reinvent itself. So it's entirely online, and people, if they just search on Charles Causley Festival, they will find it. And there's a lovely thread running through it, which I've got involved in, where they've got different local figures to recite their favourite Causley poems. And I think those are going to pop up at random, and there's going to be one evening of Causley poems. So if anyone hearing this is curious about Causley's poems, they can hear some of them before they read them.
Fantastic. It all sounds like a lot of work. You live on a farm, you're writing, you're playing the cello, you're on a book festival, you're a patron of the Charles Causley Trust, the Penzance LitFest and Literature Works. What on earth do you do to relax, Patrick? And when?
I garden and I cook and I walk the dog. It is a lot of work, but I had very worky parents. I had parents who never sat still, and imbued in all of us a sense that we were extremely privileged, and very lucky to have had, not only a happy childhood, but an amazing education, in my case especially, and that we must make use of that and put it back. So a part of me would feel very guilty if I just sat in this lovely room and wrote novels and did nothing else. I always felt this very strong compulsion to be a bit more useful. And I think writing feels very useless a lot of the time. So putting together a book festival and proselytizing about the power of literature is something very dear to my heart.
Mine too. Mine too. Mine too. It's been a joy talking to you, Patrick. Thank you so much for reading to us. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you for joining us here on the Lockdown LitFest. Patrick Gale, thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. It's been a pleasure.
So there we go. You've been listening to me chatting to Patrick Gale, whose latest book will be out. When is it out, Patrick?
Oh, heavens. When I finish writing it, probably next autumn. So autumn 2021.
Look out for next autumn. But in the meantime, you can buy his book, Take Nothing With You, which we have the reading from, which is published in 2018. Thank you for joining us. We hope you're taking care. We hope you're being safe, and we hope you're being careful. Do visit us at www.lockdownlitfest.com and sign up for the newsletter. It's a great way of staying in touch with what we're doing. And if you're watching on YouTube, do hit the subscribe button just below here. It all helps. It all helps. Thank you for joining us. Take care. Cheerio.